In the ranking of multilateral development banks, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank might not be as famous as the World Bank, but it is up and coming. The bank opened for business less than 3 years ago. It has grown from 57 to 87 members worldwide. More than $5 billion have funded 27 infrastructure projects in countries like India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and the list continues. China is the bank's headquarters and the initiator and the biggest backer, contributing a quarter of the bank's capital. However, the bank's China connection has also been reason for some to be skeptical about and resistance from countries such as the United States. At the sideline of the Summer Davos in Tianjin, I talked to Joachim von Amsberg, who's the AIIB's vice president in charge of policy and strategy. He discussed the challenges facing the bank, including how to attract public and private investors.
Multilateral development bank that is trusted.
Joachim, welcome to CGTN.
Thank you.
There are a lot of things going on these days. Trade protectionism, unilateralism, debates about where the world is going. AIIB is relatively new. So what does that mean for a development institution like yours?
AIIB was created just 3 years ago. So we have a short story, but we're very happy with our story. I think we have began to really build a credible story of multilateral development bank that is trusted. We started with 57, now we're at 87, so we've gained 30 members over the last 2.5 years, and I think it's a sign of the confidence that has been built. Countries are trusting us. They see that we are truly multilateral.
One thing is very important. Where does the money come from? Is it only from China, or is it a partnership coming from everybody?
So our capital comes from everybody. China put up about a quarter of the capital. Half of the capital comes from the other Asian countries, and the last quarter comes from non-Asian countries, mostly Europeans and then some African and American countries. Now, beyond that capital, we will raise funds in the capital markets. So actually, the bulk of the money in the future will come from the bond markets, where we will issue our bonds.
I see. When is that going to happen?
We don't know yet for sure, because we don't need the money right now. But when the moment is right, we want to establish a presence in the capital markets, because we got our AAA ratings. We're very proud of that. It's a big sign of confidence and trust. And so we want to establish ourselves as an issuer in the capital market, and we'll do that when the time is right.
But still, you haven't answered my question, which is about vulnerability, some could say, about the AIIB as a result of all of these global changes and geopolitical debates, if not apparent wars.
So I didn't talk about that because infrastructure investments are long-term. They are meeting the needs for electricity by hundreds of millions of people, of businesses. They need the need for transport connectivity. These are long-term needs. They are not really affected by what's happening one day or the next. However, we, I think, are part of a multilateral system. We are part of a region, Asia, that shows how much the world and how much every country benefits from openness, benefits from trade, benefits from connectivity. And we really hope that the current disturbances to international trade will be temporary.
But the argument for unilateralism and concerns about globalization is exactly against that, the connectivity. So if that is rising, there seems to be much less space for AIIB for the future.
I don't think it will rise, and I have the hope and the confidence that the enlightened self-interest of all countries will prevail, that people will recognize and see the history, see how countries that have opened up, countries that have invested, countries that have promoted connectivity have done better, and that those countries which have closed their borders, have imposed protectionist measures, have fallen behind. So I don't think many countries will stay on that latter track, because in the end it does not benefit them. And Asia, East Asia, is such a shining example for the benefits of openness.
The other thing about what you're doing with AIIB, and certainly the main task, infrastructure building, has a lot to do with the debates that we see in different countries. For a certain administration, they would agree to do certain projects, and they are very eager to push forward those projects. But then once the administration changes, it seems that the country has changed its mind, at least in the federal government. So what does that mean for AIIB? Once again, the vulnerability within it.
So on the one hand, we clearly follow country priorities. We have our project quality requirements. We require that projects that we finance are financially and economically viable. We require that they follow international social, environment and governance standards, so that money isn't wasted in corruption, that people aren't hurt, or that the environment isn't hurt. So we have these long-term standards, and we require them from all projects that we finance. I think that will ensure that our financing will stay relevant. We're also asking, what is the infrastructure need of the future? And invest in those projects that we believe will be relevant tomorrow, in 10 years, in 20 years.
But as you may know, that process could be very messy. So AIIB, with a very lean team, are you ready for all these exacting works?
We have to be, but the primary responsibility lies with the government, lies with the company that does the project. We are a bank, and we care about the standards because we don't want to finance projects that do damage, but the responsibility for implementing the project is the government or the company, our borrower.
Are you kicking the ball back to their court?
No, but it's the responsibility. The country is in charge of it, the government is in charge of its own country. And we cannot be the policeman of another country. That would actually be quite inappropriate.
Right.
We can just be the bank that insists on high quality projects and insists that our financing is not used when people are hurt or when funds are misused in corruption.
After a successful operation for 3 years, AIIB has not, in fact, achieved its operation amount, financial operation amount, which has been the goal set earlier. What is the reason behind this?
Because quality comes first. In the end, we look at the pipeline of projects, and we only approve financing for projects when the project is well prepared and meets our standards. We announced expectations about how much we would finance, but we didn't know exactly how much demand there would be, and we didn't know how well prepared each project was.
Yes.
But in doubt, if a project isn't ready, we need to send it back and say, no, we need to do more work on it.
There's one thing that people really are looking at, that is the amount of investment that you're putting in. Of course, assuming those are safe, and therefore showing your capabilities.
Well, one of our peer institutions, the Asian Development Bank, has estimated 1.7 trillion of infrastructure investment needs in developing Asia per year.
Yes.
Now, that exceeds by far our capacity, and the capacity of the World Bank, and the capacity of the Asian Development Bank. So all we need to do is work in partnership. Ask whether our financing can help unlock the financing by others, and in particular by private investors, and in particular by institutional investors who are having on their under management tens and tens of trillions of dollars that they would like to deploy for good returns.
Projects of infrastructure, projects of connectivity, there have been very different views about the feasibility of those projects, whether it is between China and some of the Asian countries, and the IMF's views about that, and things like that. Will it still be the same, the close cooperation between some of the other development banks and financial agencies and AIIB?
I think the differences you're referring to are much more differences, let's say, between individual countries' governments and an international organization, or between financial institutions and the government. I have not seen serious disagreement between the multilateral development banks, because we are so similar in structure and policy, and similar in our mindset to help our clients with high quality projects, and similar in that we are not driven by a single country's needs, but we are driven by the collective of the international community that forms our membership. So we have a very technical view on projects. We don't ask about the politics. We ask, is the project good for the people in that country, economically, socially, environmentally? And typically when technical people ask that question, they come to similar conclusions on, in particular, infrastructure projects where one can measure the returns easier than, let's say, in social sector projects.
People have been thinking about whether AIIB is going to be inclusive enough. About AIIB's cooperation, We have recently noticed, Joachim, even these days, the president of AIIB, Mr. Jin, has been talking about AIIB is open to all that are willing to work with AIIB. He even said, quote, that even includes the United States, end of quote. Now, what exactly he meant? And is the U.S. already approaching AIIB for further information about cooperation?
I'm not aware of any discussions or any approachment, but I am saying any country, including of course the US, would be very welcome to approach us. It is ultimately a decision of the current membership to admit new members, but from all conversations I can tell that new members would be welcome, and that would include the US and of course also Japan.
Talking about AIIB, there's another set of questions that I really need to ask. That is, what about the returns? Infrastructure, though, it's very difficult in the short term. How shall we see the potential of AIIB embracing new partners from the private sector? Is it really possible?
So first, we are a bank, so yes, we need to be paid back. Otherwise, we cannot run as a sustainable bank with the highest quality rating. Because governments often invest in infrastructure projects that have social returns rather than financial returns. Think of rural roads. Typically the governments will pay back from its own tax revenues. On the private sector side, we expect projects to generate the necessary financial return to pay back our loan and to ideally also attract other investors into the project. So here we're talking about revenue generating infrastructure, a power plant that sells its power to the grid, a toll road that charges tolls to the users.
That's right.
This is a typical revenue generating infrastructure projects. Now, if those are financially well structured and the contracts are written well, then the experience shows in several countries that you can actually attract private capital. The presence of multilateral lenders like ourselves helps, because when private investors see that an international lender like ourselves is present, they get some comfort, because the governments that are the hosts to these projects are our shareholders. So they have no interest to hurt a project that is financed by a bank that they co-own. I think that creates very positive incentives for financial viability of projects.
But on the other hand, it's always vulnerable, particularly now if you look at the world economy. Of course, the so-called trade war is still a small number if you look at the global GDP, but it is really influencing on the confidence about the prospect of global economy, which has to be seen over a long term of its financial return. Has AIIB been thinking about this quite a lot recently?
Of course, a decline in trade would possibly reduce demand for certain transport services, for certain transport infrastructure, or even energy infrastructure. But we have not yet seen that this translates directly into demand for financing new projects or the supply of capital. I think there is still an expectation that countries will come to their senses and recognize that cooperation and the reduction of trade barriers is in everyone's interest. On the other hand, if tensions continue or expand and trade really suffered, of course there would be an impact on, for example, traffic forecasts for certain projects. That has to be factored into the financial viability calculation for each project, and maybe some projects that otherwise would have been built won't be built, but that's hypothetical so far.
Right. Is AIIB going to be able to endure all of those procedures, work on all of those details while you are also burdened with many of your development projects?
Yeah, I think it is less about our own role, because we are protected by very special immunities and privileges, because the governments of that are hosting these projects are our shareholders.
Yes.
It is more about disputes between different investors and between private investors and governments. And speedy conflict resolution is exactly one of those critical elements that investors look at. So having mechanisms, a neutral forum, an efficient mechanism to resolve disputes and conflicts is actually a very important criteria for a private investor to put their money into a long-term project.
China has been working on several things. For example, the Belt and Road Initiative, together with many partners. AIIB is an important contributor to some of the projects about the Belt and Road. And meanwhile, China has been thinking about what China calls community of shared future, meaning everybody is connected and there are common goals that we have to work together for. As AIIB, as a regional financial development institution. What do you make, from your perspective, some of the ideas China has raised and also has been in discussion with its partners?
So we believe the Belt and Road Initiative can be quite helpful to motivate countries to look at their infrastructure investment needs and to motivate investors to look at those opportunities. And Belt and Road can be helpful to coordinate investments, especially when you have transport energy projects across countries. You need to coordinate the investments on both sides of the border. So that's important. And if we get engaged in a project, it is not because the project is Belt and Road or is not Belt and Road. It is because it's a good project that has high returns for the country or in terms of financing, and a project that meets our project standards on social, environment, and governance aspects.
What if people ask you, what's your relationship, AIIB, 3 years in operation, with the country and the government of China? What exactly is it?
China has been the initiator and remains the largest shareholder of AIIB, and China has been a very strong supporter of AIIB. But China has initiated a bank in which the other 86 shareholders hold almost 3/4 of the capital. So all decisions are done in consultation, in consensus with the entirety of our shareholdership. And that's the beauty of the model. Inspired by China, led by China, but with very clear, transparent, and effective multilateral governance where every country has a very clear voice in decision making.
Joachim, what a pleasure to see you here and see the efficiency of AIIB even within the answers you give. Such a pleasure. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you very much for your interest. Thank you. Thank you.